And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome to Open Connection. I'm your host, Robert Pictou. Between 1988 and 1995, dioxin furan contamination resulted in sailfish harvesting restrictions along the British Columbia coast. On today's Open Connection, we open our archive to discover how the pulp industry responded to this study.
The ability to measure them in very small amounts has improved. And because they can be measured in small amounts, they're being found in surprising places. So it's become an issue because basically our ability to detect them has improved.
Dioxins and furans are a group of about 100 related organic chemicals which are found quite widespread in the environment in very, very trace quantities. They're formed from a range of natural and man-made sources, including forest fires and municipal incinerators, and the production of some chemicals. They've tended to become, because there are so many sources, they are fairly widespread in the environment, but in very, very trace quantities. Almost all chemicals, be they natural or man-made, when they're fed to laboratory animals in sufficiently high dosages, will cause harmful effects to the animals. And dioxins, in particular certain isomers of the dioxin family, produce harmful effects in very low concentrations, and as a result dioxin has got its reputation for being a quite toxic material. Fortunately, the amounts of dioxin that are found in the environment are normally very much lower still than the levels that are found to cause harm. So it's a question of both the potency of a given chemical to cause harm and also the concentrations you find it at.
Despite the small quantities, there is reason to be concerned about dioxins and furans. The most well-known dioxin, called 2378-TCDD, is considered the most deadly chemical known to man, and many people believe no quantity of dioxin, no matter how small, is without effect. The environmental group Greenpeace says dioxins can cause cancer, liver malfunction, reproductive disorders, including birth defects, and suppression of the immune system. The amounts of dioxins and furans found near BC pulp mills aren't expected to cause any immediate effects on people eating shellfish from those areas, but the compounds don't break down easily and accumulate up the food chain.
That's a concern, and it's taken into account when the regulatory bodies develop their standards. All of the bioaccumulation potential, as well as the input from all potential different sources, is carefully taken into account when these regulations and standards are set. And then on top of all of that, there's always a wide measure of caution that's inserted to so-called margin of safety, so that the amounts found that people come into contact with are much lower than the levels which could be expected to produce harm.
Workers at Prince Rupert Skeena Cellulose Pulp Mill deal with a lot of chemicals, but they share the concerns over dioxins and furans.
I don't think it's been blown out of proportion. I think it's become a major concern because it has received some high-profile attention, and you know, our people have been in contact with these chemicals over the years without any knowledge. So you know, it's becoming a serious matter. You know, especially some of the old-timers that have been out in the plant, and all of a sudden these things are coming to light, and they're really concerned.
Are your members particularly concerned about their exposure to dioxins and so on in the mill or into the environment?
Well, I would say it's twofold, on the mill as well as in the environment. A lot of our guys are, you know, enjoy fishing and crabbing and stuff like that. So, you know, it's a twofold concern, environment as well as exposure within the mill. Within the mill, we don't really know, because of the operation, where our members are in contact.
A union publication points to a high mortality rate among pulp mill workers for a rare type of cancer known as non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Vietnam vets, forestry herbicide applicators, and some farmers exposed to 2,4-D appear to share the high mortality rate. A common contaminant to all is the dioxin 2378-TCDD. The connection between dioxins and pulp mills surfaced in 1986 after a study by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency found the compounds in effluent, sludge, and pulp at 5 bleach kraft mills in the United States.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thank you for staying with us. Dioxins are environmental pollutants. They belong to the so-called dirty dozen, a group of dangerous chemicals known as persistent organic pollutants. Let us return to the archives as Kathy Brooks reports on testing results near pulp mills.
In 1988, the government decided to step up testing for dioxins near pulp mills. In May of that year, Environment Canada released the first results from sampling at 14 pulp and paper mills from 4 provinces. But it took another 6 months and more tests before any action was taken at 3 BC hotspots. Those spots were near Prince Rupert's pulp mill and near the Portmelon and wood fiber mills along Howe Sound on the south coast. At Prince Rupert, crab harvesting was banned in Wainwright Basin and Porpoise Harbor. The impact was minimal because only a few people were taking crabs from the area recreationally. But on Howe Sound, a number of commercial crab, shrimp, and prawn fishermen were forced to move to cleaner waters. Following the shellfish closures, the BC government announced it would crack down on the flow of dioxins and furans into the environment. About 6 months later, in May 1989, the province outlined its plans.
Actually, no new regulations have been imposed yet, but the ministry's intention is to impose a limit of 2.5 kilograms per ton of AOX and secondary treatment by the end of 1991, and by the end of 1994 impose a limit of 1.5 kilograms per ton of AOX in the discharges.
But while the mills scramble to implement the needed changes, more shellfish enclosures have been announced. In June this year, the Department of Fisheries extended its crab harvesting ban near Prince Rupert's mill to include Morse Basin and South to Coast Island. Harvesting shrimp in Porpoise Harbor, South to Coast Island, was also banned, and people were cautioned not to eat mussels from the same area. On the south coast, all of Howe Sound was closed to commercial crabbing, and the existing closures for prawn and shrimp were extended. Then, just last month, more closures were announced. They included Kitimat, Powell River, Gold River, Elk Falls, Nanaimo, Crofton, and Cowichan Bay. The closures at Prince Rupert remained.
What's happening here is the minister is basically giving a license to pollute by not laying any charges, by not even announcing any charges, by refusing to make a substantive comment in relation to compensation. The minister is sending a clear green light to the pulp mills in British Columbia to continue dumping poison into the waters of British Columbia, and what we're seeing is it's expanding like a huge cancer on the British Columbia coast.
The United Fishermen and Allied Workers Union has accused the government of creating fisherman-free zones instead of pollution-free zones, but the government argues the solutions aren't easy.
Well, shutting the mills down themselves is not going to eliminate or remove the problem. The mills have to correct the problem. They still have to continue operating. There's a significant impact on British Columbia, the operation of these mills.
If we were to shut down the mills tomorrow, we're not going to see an immediate nor necessarily rapid recovery of the aquatic environment and the corresponding levels of these contaminants in the tissues.
The pulp mills now have until the end of 1991 to have their effluent treatment systems up and running, and until 1994 to make the major reductions in organochlorines discharged into the environment. Repap Enterprises' Skeena Cellulose division is well on its way toward meeting those deadlines at its Prince Rupert pulp mill. Along with the government, the pulp industry has been studying ways to cut the production of dioxins and furans in its mills. It's identified the ways the poisons are created in the pulp-making process. Experts like Jim Waring of the Pulp and Paper Research Institute of Canada have been providing advice to companies such as Skeena Cellulose.
Yeah, there's two main sources of trace contamination by dioxin. One originates from a sap stain control agent that's added by sawmills to preserve green lumber called PCP, or pentachlorophenol. This material contains compounds which react in the pulping process of the kraft mills, not in the bleaching process, but the pulping process, to form trace amounts of hexachlorodioxins. The second major source, it comes from unchlorinated precursor compounds to the dioxins, which, when the conditions are improperly developed in the bleach plant, can be formed by reaction with chlorine. There are a number of strategies which we have developed in order to eliminate the formation of chlorinated dioxins in the bleach plant, and these involve both control or elimination of the input of the contaminants and also the control of the chlorination conditions.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thank you for staying with us. In the environment, dioxins tend to accumulate in the food chain. The higher the animal is in the food chain, the higher the concentration of dioxins. Let us return to the archives as Kathy Brooks reports how pulp mill industry is responding to reports.
As mentioned, the PCP, or pentachlorophenols, are a chemical that has been used in the treatment of lumber for bacterial decay or growth, and we have phased out the use of these PCP chips in our supply of chips to the mill. So that has been done. The defoamers have been identified as a product that carries impurities with them, and these impurities being precursors, which are the chemical which leads to dioxins and furans. So the use of these clean defoamers is something that we embarked on, and again, it's something that we are up to the point now of having completed or having done.
Defoamers are used to keep down the froth when pulp is washed. Skinna Cellulose experimented with water-based defoamers as an alternative to the contaminated oil-based ones the mill was using. But while the experiments went on, the chemical companies cleaned up the oil-based agents. The mill has now gone back to those because they work better than the water-based defoamers in Prince Rupert's operation.
The second part here is actually get into the reduction of the chlorine ratio. There's several parts to that. Let me explain this. The washing of the pulp in a better way to ensure that the carryover of the chemicals in the pulp to the next stage does not occur, because that carryover causes more chlorine to be used. We implemented about a year and a half ago better brown stock washing, and so again there's another item that has been done. In the last couple of years, the technology for the proper mixing of chlorine and pulp has been advanced, and we have taken advantage of that, and in both of our A mill and B mill we have installed the newer, most modern, technologically advanced chlorination mixer. So that has been done. The installation of automatic control of chlorination addition is technology that we implemented in one mill about a year ago and in the other mill about 6 months ago, and so we are state-of-the-art with respect to that. So I can say that as a result of these implementations here, our chlorine usage in the last 2 to 3 years has been reduced by about 15%. The next step, which is important in this reduction of the chlorine ratio, is to do a major substitution of chlorine by chlorine dioxide. And we at present, when we started 3 years ago into knowing more about dioxins and furans, we are at about 10% substitution. Today we are at 30% substitution, which represents about a 20% reduction in the chlorine from the original time till now. We still have a step to go yet, and that is to go to a level of substitution which ensures the non-detection of chlorines and furans. So that is certainly in our plans for 1990, and that's really the only part of this program that's left to be done. but it is in the planning stage and being completed.
While chlorine and chlorine dioxide may not sound much different, the two chemicals don't react the same in the bleaching process. Unlike chlorine, chlorine dioxide doesn't contribute to the creation of dioxins and furans.
As a result of these steps here, by reducing the impurities as well as reducing the chlorine ratio, we're confident that we will get to the point that PPRIC is saying the non-detectable levels will be evident not only in our effluent, not only in our sludge, but also in our pulp as well. So the customer is happy, the environment won't see the chemicals, and the material that we have to dispose of will not have any dioxins or furans in them either.
In addition to cutting production of dioxins and furans, the measures being taken inside the mill will help reduce the amount of other organochlorines discharged into the environment. The other organochlorines aren't as toxic, but they come in much larger quantities and will also be part of the government's new regulations. Skeena Cellulose's other big pollution project will help break down some of the organochlorines still produced. It's the secondary effluent treatment system now required by the provincial government, and it's a big project, both in the area it covers and in the cost, almost $60 million.
Presently, the sketch shows the arrangement that we have for our liquid effluent. Above here, this shows the pulp mill as it exists now. The lines in red represent the sewer lines which collect the effluent and gravity feed it into Porpoise Harbor. And there's essentially no treatment that's done to it right now. With the new facility, we'll be intercepting that flow before it gets to Porpoise Harbor. And that's shown on this diagram here. We'll collect the effluent at a pumping station. It'll be pumped to our treatment facility, which is shown here, and it's gravity fed through the various stages, and then the clean water is gravity fed back out to Porpoise Harbor. Now, the amount of liquid that we're treating is 40 million gallons a day. Now, this diagram shows the treatment facility, this area, in a little more detail. First, the untreated effluent enters the primary clarifier, where the solids have a chance to settle out. These solids are then collected and sent to sludge disposal, and I'll talk about that a little later. The clear effluent that would overflow the primary clarifier then goes into a bioreactor. Now, this bioreactor, its intention is to breed microorganisms, or bugs as they're referred to, that actually feed on the dissolved waste that can't settle out in the primary clarifier. Now, these bugs, if you want to call them that, require oxygen to survive, so we feed pure oxygen and other nutrients to keep a healthy population of bugs. Then, after being exposed to the microorganisms, the liquid passes into the secondary clarifiers, where we separate out the bugs. The microorganisms or bugs, they settle to the bottom, and the clean effluent overflows and is sent back to Porpoise Harbor. Now, the sludge that's collected from the primary and secondary clarifiers, we dewater that sludge and burn it in our boilers.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Once dioxins enter the body, they last a long time because of their chemical stability and their ability to be absorbed by fat tissue. Their half-life in the body is estimated to be 7 to 11 years. In this final segment of Open Connection, let us return to the archives as Kathy Brooks reports on the community response to dioxins.
Trying to get a grip on the dioxin issue is almost as difficult for pulp mill workers as it is for the general public, even with the benefit of a joint environmental committee with the company.
Part of the problem with our committee is that the guys that are on it really don't have a technical background. They're just workers in the mill. Like, I'm a millwright. You know, I went to school a few years ago. My chemistry wasn't all that hot. So, you know, it's difficult for us to be experts when it comes to these things, because a lot of these things are highly technical. We were told when the committee was set up that the company would not give us documentation that would be able to be used against them. So this in a way has stifled us as being able to do a job properly.
The union officials also have doubts about the way the government monitors pulp mill pollution. They say the mill often knows exactly when samples will be taken. They suspect the mill may dilute its effluent with water on some occasions, and they say one set of samples was taken while the mill was shut down. So what if the monitoring over the next few years doesn't show the reduction in pollution that's required?
We have a high degree of confidence, Kathy, because in addition to the effluent treatment facility that we're installing, as other people have told you, we're doing several things in-house as well. So we have a relatively high degree of confidence that we are going to meet the government regulations. Now, if, however, that doesn't happen, which we're not anticipating, there are other technologies available today and will probably be developed by that time. So there are things that we can do incremental with oxygen that we're not doing right now. So we have backup positions. In other words, we haven't said that this is it and we're not doing anymore. We're prepared to do whatever is required to meet the permit regulations.
Those other options could include oxygen delignification, a process promoted by Greenpeace and now used in some other countries. Skeena Cellulose has more to do yet on another form of pollution too. Like its discharges into the water, emissions from Prince Rupert's mill into the air have exceeded traditional pollution standards for years. Its special permit allowing the extra pollution runs out at the end of 1990.
By the end of 90, we must be in compliance on the air side as well. We have an older vintage recovery boiler that is not state-of-the-art in today's technology, and our current plan is to upgrade that boiler, and we plan on spending roughly $40 million to do the whole 9 yards and getting the air side in compliance as well. It's really interesting to note that when George Petty bought the mill in 1986, that we are spending in 1989 and 1990 the equivalent amount of what he bought the whole mill for. So his statement in terms of environmental responsibility is not an empty one, because obviously to spend that kind of money is a demonstration and a manifestation of commitment, as opposed to a statement on a piece of paper, because he's putting his money where his environmental statement is.
Perhaps it's lucky the dioxin problem was discovered at a time when the pulp industry couldn't complain about a shortage of money. Some environmentalists and politicians argue the government still isn't cracking down quickly enough, but the industry is reacting more quickly than it's probably used to. Still, even if all the changes work, the dioxins and furans won't disappear from the environment overnight. The Department of Fisheries expects the shellfish enclosures to remain in place for several years at least. And still, no one knows everything about these poisons. Finding them in Kitimat Harbor was a surprise for many because Eurocan pulp and paper doesn't bleach its pulp. Are there other sources of these toxins no one has considered before? And what about the people who've been eating shellfish from the closed areas? Has anyone eaten enough over the years to suffer ill effects? And what about the loss of those fisheries? Will commercial and native fishermen win compensation from the polluters through the courts? It will be years before we know all the answers.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance in the existence of man is not from here to there, but the connection from his mind to his heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our immensity within. I'm Robert Pictou.